further ado, I would like to give the floor to Howard Duncan. Howard.
Thank you very much, Jan, and welcome to everybody. It's good to see you all here. I want to start by thanking Metropolis for organizing this meeting for us, and special thanks to my friend and colleague Jan Roth, who has supported the idea of organizing this webinar right from the beginning. So the title of the session is intended to be provocative. It is From Crisis to Crisis, Syrian Refugees in Lebanon. And of course, the references to the two crises are straightforward to initially the civil war in Syria that produced very large scale refugee flows. And the second crisis is the situation that these same refugees are facing in Lebanon. Now, even though this is not a recognition of an anniversary, I think we should note that this is the 10th year since refugees from Syria started arriving in large numbers in Lebanon. But of course, not only Lebanon. The Syrian refugees traveled to other neighboring countries, most notably Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt, and then later, of course, started making their way to Europe and elsewhere. But that this has been going on for 10 years would qualify this refugee situation as a protracted refugee situation. And what we want to do today is reflect, in part what we want to do is reflect on the fact that this is now a lengthy, protracted refugee situation. Of course, there are many complications here. One of which is, as it were, a legal or administrative complication of the fact that Lebanon is not among the signatories to the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention. And it's very interesting to think about what Lebanon has done to support refugees from Syria, despite the fact that they are not signatories and therefore do not have the same obligations under international law that signatory countries do have. And then the other complication is the history, the often very difficult history of relations between Lebanon and Syria, which of course predates the civil war in Syria. So one question that we might want to look at during our discussion later is what the effects of this long history might be for the refugees in Lebanon. Jan mentioned that we have three terrific speakers, and I completely concur with that characterization. So what I'll do now is introduce all three speakers and then turn the floor over to them. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jeff Crisp, who is a specialist on refugee migration and humanitarian issues at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, where he has been not for all that long, because he made his career at the UNHCR. He held a number of senior positions with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And I got to know Jeff when he was the head of policy development and evaluation. Jeff also served with the Global Commission on International Migration, as well as with Refugees International. Jeff has firsthand experience of refugee situations throughout the world and has published, lectured, and broadcast extensively on humanitarian issues. His PhD is in African Studies from the University of Birmingham. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Faten Kakano, who is a researcher at the Centre d'études en responsabilité sociale et éco-citoyenneté, which is a research center in Montreal that targets social innovation through participative approaches. She holds a PhD from the Faculty of Environmental Studies at the Université de Montréal. Following 20 years of experience as a practitioner in architecture and design and an instructor in the most prestigious universities in Lebanon, Faten oriented her career towards research in refugee spaces. and she defended her dissertation only 2 months ago. A dissertation that was, I'm happy to be able to report, was rated by the university as exceptional. Faten studies the appropriation of refugee spaces, both camps and non-camps, based on a transdisciplinary approach revealing the political, socioeconomic, legal, and humanitarian issues that influence refugees' living environments. She's now working on homelessness in Montreal, on space appropriation in Indigenous territories, and on living spaces of temporary migrant workers in Canada. Our third speaker is Dr. Carmen Jaha, who is an associate professor of public administration, leadership, and organizational development at the American University of Beirut. She is also a co-founder and research associate at the Center for Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women, a regional reference for gender-inclusive employers across the Arab and MENA region. At the CIBL for Women, Dr. Jaha contributes to a transdisciplinary research team working with employers in 11 Arab MENA countries. Dr. Jaha's research examines the nexus between politics and public institutions with a focus on 3 areas of specialization. First, women's political and economic participation. Second, refugee crisis politics and policies. And third, civil society and protest movements. Carmen's PhD is in international relations from the University of St. Andrews. So these are our speakers. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them. And so we'll begin with Jeff Crisp. Jeff, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Howard, and hello to everybody wherever you are. The title of my presentation today is The Syrian Refugee Emergency in Historical and Global Perspective. The word unprecedented is one of the most familiar in the humanitarian vocabulary. When a new emergency breaks out, when a famine looms, or when significant numbers of refugees begin to leave their own country, it can be almost guaranteed that a succession of aid agencies will suggest that the situation is an unprecedented one. Now, while this word has become seriously overused in the humanitarian world, I think there is some justification for describing Syria's refugee emergency over the past decade as being an unprecedented one. Let me explain why. First, the Syrian refugee crisis has been unusual in terms of the speed with which it erupted and the number of people involved in it. In the first few months of the non-violent uprising against the Assad regime, very few Syrians felt the need to abandon their homeland. But as the Syrian military sought to suppress the protest and armed resistance to the regime began, refugee numbers skyrocketed. By early 2015, some 4 million people had left the country, and today at least 6.6 million Syrians are living abroad. Second, the Syrian refugee emergency has been characterized by its broad geographical scope, as Howard has already indicated. In the early days of the crisis, the majority of refugees fled to neighboring and nearby states, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. But the scope of the exodus expanded substantially in 2015 and 2016, when large numbers of Syrian refugees who had initially fled to Turkey began to move towards Europe, triggering a similar and simultaneous movement of other refugees from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the Middle East. A third important characteristic of the Syrian refugee emergency is to be found in the serious consequences it has had for host countries that have admitted the largest number of refugees. Lebanon, for example, a country with a fragile economy and political system, and still recovering from its own protracted conflict, has a Syrian refugee population of well over 1 million, and has currently one of the highest ratios of refugees to citizens anywhere in the world. Fourth, and in large part because of its unusual speed, size, and scope, the Syrian refugee emergency has demanded an exceptional response from the international community. While it is impossible to calculate the full cost of that response, There is no doubt the level of funding required for Syrian refugees has been, to use that word once again, unprecedented. Looking at the UN alone, the organization appealed for $5 billion in refugee aid in 2013, for a further $7 billion in 2017, and a further $10 billion this year. Finally, the Syrian refugee situation has been characterized by its protracted and intractable nature, sometimes to the surprise of the refugees themselves. Interviewing Syrians throughout the Middle East in early 2013, I was told by them that many had left their homeland in the expectation that the Assad regime would be quickly overthrown and that they would soon be able to go back to their homes. But in a second visit I took to the region the following year, such optimism had diminished substantially, and many refugees were resigning themselves to a lengthy period in exile. And of course, they were proven to be right in that respect. Today, none of the traditional solutions to refugee situations, that is, voluntary repatriation, local integration, or resettlement, none of those traditional solutions are available to the vast majority of Syrian refugees. Lebanon particularly has hardened its attitude towards the refugee presence, encouraging and inducing them to repatriate prematurely, and some may well feel obliged to do so. The most recent surveys that I've seen indicate that some 90% of Syrian refugees in the Middle East are now living in abject poverty and are unable to meet their basic needs. I'd also like to suggest that the Syrian refugee emergency has been of particular significance in terms of the impact it's had on the international refugee regime as a whole, and on the way in which states, the UN, and other stakeholders respond to mass movements of people. So let me give you just 3 examples of the broader impact that the Syrian refugee emergency has had in recent years. First, while the refugee issue has been of concern to the international community for many decades, the Syrian emergency propelled the question of large-scale population movements to the very top of the global policy agenda. It created a widespread perception, perhaps a mistaken one, but it created the perception that the world was confronted with what was often described as a global refugee crisis, and prompted the UN to launch a process that was intended to produce a more effective response to the issue. This included a summit meeting in the General Assembly and a declaration in New York in 2016, the establishment of a global compact on refugees in 2018, and a meeting convened in Geneva in 2019 titled the Global Refugee Forum. Now, these various initiatives to address refugee issues more effectively have raised many expectations, but I'd also like to suggest that they have some serious limitations. The Global Compact on Refugees, for example, is a non-binding document that does not impose specific obligations on states. And since it was established in 2018, many states that endorsed the document have continued to act in a way that violates its basic principles. And of course, the unexpected appearance of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 has provided a perfect alibi for states to close their borders to refugees, to repatriate those who they had already admitted, and to reduce the level of aid which they provided to overseas refugee programs. Second, I'd like to suggest that the Syrian refugee emergency has encouraged the international community to recognize that short-term and humanitarian approaches to refugee emergencies are inadequate, and that they must be complemented by longer-term and developmental programs that support both refugees and, in addition, the states and the communities that host those refugees. Now, of course, there is nothing new whatsoever in this notion. Indeed, the need for such developmental approaches has been acknowledged and discussed since the early 1960s. But attempts to implement this approach have had relatively little success, largely because humanitarian and development organizations on one hand, and donor and host states on the other, have found it very difficult to work together and agree on common objectives, priorities, and working methods. Because of its speed and its scale and its impact on geopolitically important but fragile host countries such as Lebanon, and its heavy demands on humanitarian funding, the Syrian refugee emergency put the issue of developmental approaches to refugee support firmly back on the international agenda. And this time round, the results appear to be much more positive, with the World Bank playing a particularly active role in placing displacement on the global development agenda. As pointed out in a recent report by the Migration Policy Institute, and I quote, initially sparked by the Syrian crisis, partnerships between host and donor countries, international institutions, civil society, and the private sector have brought about innovative strategies to meet the needs of both Syrian refugees and host communities, end of quote. It now remains to be seen whether that approach can be sustained, whether it can bring tangible benefits to refugees and host communities in countries such as Lebanon, and whether it can be replicated in other and poorer parts of the world. A third way in which the Syrian crisis has influenced the international community's global approach to the refugee issue is to be seen in the settlement and assistance strategies used to support refugees. For many years, refugee assistance programs conformed to a fairly standard model. When large numbers of refugees arrived in a country, they would be accommodated in and sometimes confined to camps. They survived by means of relief programs that provided them with minimal support in the form of tents, blankets, food, water, and other items. But those refugees were generally denied access to land and to the labour market. Now, while the inadequacies of this traditional approach have been evident for at least 20 years, it was really the Syrian refugee crisis that encouraged the international community to look for an alternative settlement and assistance paradigm. And as a result of the policies pursued by the governments of countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, there is now a new recognition that rather than being placed in and confined to camps, refugees might be given an opportunity to take up residence in urban areas or with host communities. And after many years of hesitation on the issue, UNHCR also, again very much influenced by the Syrian emergency, now promotes the notion that refugees should enjoy freedom of movement and that they should become self-reliant by finding work and other livelihoods opportunities. UNHCR's current policy, again heavily influenced by the Syrian emergency, is that those refugees who are unable to work, who are unable to find livelihood opportunities, and who are unable to support themselves should be assisted not by the distribution of food and other relief items, but by means of regular cash transfers. And this is a real change in the paradigm of refugee assistance. Now, in principle, this new paradigm that I've been trying to describe, in principle, I think it has a number of advantages for all stakeholders concerned, for refugees, for host communities, for donor states, for countries of asylum, for humanitarian agencies, and for development organizations. I will leave the other speakers on the panel to say whether the approach that has been introduced in the Syrian context is actually producing those benefits in the case of Lebanon. The fact that so many of the refugees are reported to be living in abject poverty at the moment seems to suggest that the fruits of this approach are not yet fully apparent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I find your analysis very, very interesting. The idea that the traditional approaches to refugee situations being replaced, perhaps, or at least supplemented by a developmental approach. It's a very interesting take on this. People in policy always are on the watch for unintended consequences, and I'll ask you to reflect later on whether or not essentially accepting that there are going to be protracted situations and therefore de facto local integration of refugees might in fact result in a tightening of borders by some countries as their response. But I'll ask you to think about that over the next little while because I always do worry about especially after COVID, when countries have learned how to shut their borders more effectively than before. Fatin Kano, over to you, please.
Thank you, Howard. I'm going to share my screen. Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, it's just fine. It looks good.
Thank you, Jeff, for this great introduction. In my presentation, I will focus on specifically on the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So what happens when a large refugee population is hosted by a precarious state with a weak and unstable governance system? And when a number of disasters occur and destabilizes even more their situation. There are visible disasters and there are invisible disasters that are affecting presently the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Today, I'm going to focus about the invisible disasters. Jumping back on how Jeff described the crisis in general as unprecedented, I believe that I can describe the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon as unprecedented as well. Not in the precarity of the host country, since despite the fact that the crisis is described as global, 83% of Syrian refugees are hosted in neighboring countries. So most of these countries are developing countries who have different levels of political and economic precarity. It is not unprecedented with the short-term policies that are adopted by Lebanon, because neighboring countries are not very welcoming towards Syrian refugees. As Jeff mentioned, most of these countries have not signed the 1951 conventions and are considered to be countries of transit rather than countries of asylum. In Lebanon, Syrians do not even possess the status of refugees and are considered to be displaced populations. However, the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon is unprecedented in three specific aspects. First, at the beginning of the crisis, borders with Syria have been kept open. Second, at the beginning of the crisis, the government was almost completely absent from managing the crisis. And third, camps have been prohibited in Lebanon. There are no organized camps for Syrian refugees. The picture you see is that of an organized camp in the town of Kab Elias in the Bekaa, but it is an organized camp, one of the very few organized camps that were built on private land and managed by a number of NGOs. The UNHCR and the government has got nothing to do with this type of housing for Syrian refugees. The consequences of these three particularities in the Lebanese hosting policy, described by the policy of no policy, is the number of Syrian refugees hosted. Jeff mentioned that it's the highest ratio of refugees per number of population in the world. And second, the absenteeism of the government led to the transfer of the management of the crisis to municipality that became the sole authority and that acted like small states with policies that range from hospitality to complete restrictions of refugees and creating an imbalance of the number of refugees hosted inside Lebanese towns. And the third consequence is that camps have been prohibited, but with no other housing plan for them. And with them being deprived from right to space because of their institutional precarity, Syrian refugees were left to self-settle on their own. And they spread all over the Lebanese territory in more than 2,100 localities. The first disaster that hit them is the lack of resources. Their presence in Lebanon added more pressure on an already extremely strained system. The second visible disasters were the 17 October revolution. The second is the financial and liquidity crisis, both caused by corruption and by the lack of government to provide services such as electricity, water, sanitary, basic services, and the corruption of the government that led to the financial crisis. In February 2020, the country was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And on August 4, the Beirut port explosion killed more than 200, injured thousands, and left almost 300,000 people homeless. So all of these visible disasters triggered further effects on the country's fragile social, economic, political, and health systems. But as I said, I will focus on the invisible disasters, mainly 2 points. First, the consequences of the absenteeism of the Lebanese government, and second, the so-called freedom to settle for Syrian refugees. I will start with the first point. So the government's absence or the government's disengagement from managing the crisis was caused by a number of reasons. First, it is by itself a policy of exclusion and a message that the government was sending to the international community of its refusal to accept hosting Syrians on the Lebanese territory. Second, it's the mistrust of the international community towards the government that has a reputation of corruption. And third, the political division over the Syrian conflict that disabled the government from taking, from the beginning of the crisis, a clear position. Later on in 2014, the government produced a policy paper regarding hosting strategy for Syrian refugees. But it is a policy of exclusion from the beginning till the end. But the absenteeism of the government led to the destabilization of formal governance structure and the emergence of informal governance structures that are formed by private actors that was, in most cases, to the disadvantage of refugees. We can see that in the neighborhood of Nab'a, a small, poor neighborhood in the eastern suburban of Beirut. And what happens in Nab'a does indeed stay in Nab'a, because Nab'a is governed by a local mafia of Lebanese owners and employers who are in their majority Shia with an allegiance to the powerful Hezbollah. And this power imbalance between the owners and the municipality prevent the municipality in particular and the government in general from intervening inside the neighborhood. This is why many Syrians live in Nab'a, because the governance of this informal mafia and their illegal practices, dividing apartments, renting commercial spaces, allowing many families to live in the same apartment, those illegal practices allow Syrian refugees to survive. But their survival comes at a very high price, because they endure the abuse and exploitation of the local mafia. They endure the hostility of the Lebanese poor communities that they replaced, because the initially tenants in this neighborhood were Lebanese. They were expelled to be replaced by Syrians. So their survival comes at a very high price. The same pattern can be observed in informal settlement, this pattern of emerging informal governance structure. In the case of informal settlement, it is the Shaweesh, and I say the lordship of the Shaweesh because the Shaweesh is the sole manager and the sole authority inside those settlements. This is a settlement in the town of Kab Elias in the Bekaa, And what happens is that the Shaweesh rents the land from the Lebanese owner at a very high price. He divides it into plots. He rents it to the Syrians who are living inside the settlement, keeping a part of the benefit for himself. He is also responsible for the employment of Syrians, and he also keeps a part of their very poor daily wage for himself. He communicates with the municipality, he communicates with the humanitarian organizations, and he organizes who gets humanitarian aid or not. And in the case of Kab Elias, what is different from the case of Naba, where the municipality would like to intervene but is forbidden from intervening, the municipality and the government, they are present in Kab Elias, but they are only present to add restrictions on refugees and not to protect them. So Syrians have to live, very poor Syrians, they have to live in these informal settlements because the most vulnerable Syrians are the most isolated one, but this also comes at a very high price. And despite the homogeneous appearance of the settlement, if we look at the internal space, we can see the injustice and the very important socioeconomic hierarchy. This settlement is that of an elderly couple, and that one is the madafi that is used by the Shaweesh for special occasions and for ceremonies. And I believe that what is going on inside this settlement is obvious by looking at the space from inside. The second invisible disaster is the so-called freedom to settle that was for which the country was praised, and which is to me a poison gift. So what is the importance of letting refugees settle outside camps when they are disempowered and when they have no right to space and when there is no plan and no strategy to support their settlement? Back to Naba, this is the shop of Muhammad, and this is the picture on the right shows where Muhammad lives. And this is the type of spaces that are being rented to Syrians at extremely high prices. This is another small shop where the Syrian refugees lives and eats. And another typology, even the rooftops in Naba are being rented at very, very high prices. And this makes me wonder, what is the difference between Naba and the camp? There are repetitive evictions. The prices are exploitative, and the employment conditions are extremely bad, which make the refugees dependent on humanitarian aid. There is also a restriction on their movement, despite the fact that they are in an urban neighborhood, because outside, their tormentors have become their protectors, because outside the neighborhood, the army can arrest them. Inside the neighborhood, the army has no authority because of this power imbalance that I previously mentioned. So what is the value of the freedom of movement in the case of Naba? And those repetitive evictions happen also on the scale of informal settlement. This is one of my case studies, a settlement in the village of Dalhami in the municipality of Zahle. And in one of the field works, this is what happened. And it was the third eviction of the settlement because the landowner was raising the price, the first two evictions, and the third eviction was because the settlement was located near a road that the army used. This is also one of my case studies. It's one of the very rare organized camps in Kab Elias, a very hospitable municipality towards refugees. And I'm sorry for the quality of the picture, but because I found it on the news. I saw that the army completely dismantled the camp without any valuable reason. And I conclude with these 4 points. First, refugees are excluded institutionally, spatially, and socially. But paradoxically, they are included economically. because people accept to rent houses, they accept to rent land, and they accept to employ them in the informal market. And this is what I call in my research hospitality, a hostile hospitality, because refugees are not excluded, or rather their exclusion does not really aim to make them leave the country. Their exclusion aims to fragilize them and to make them more vulnerable to predatory behaviors. 2, when the governance of a host state is weak, this triggers the emergence of informal governance systems that control refugees and exploit them. 3, the question should not be camps or no camps. And this must ring a bell for the time that I spent in Oxford, where Jeff was my mentor, and when he saw my question about the camps or no camps issue. So the question should not be whether there should be camps or no camps. The question should be whether refugees are empowered or disempowered, whether refugees are included or excluded. There are no camps in Lebanon for Syrian refugees, yet they live in miserable conditions because they are disempowered and excluded. 4, the unshared burden. The international community is doing a lot, but it is not doing enough for Lebanon and its hosts. How a state that fails to provide safety, security, stability, services for its own citizens is supposed to become a safe haven for vulnerable people fleeing the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faten. Having the images to go along with your presentation is it's very powerful, and it's quite moving to see the conditions in which the Syrian refugees are living. What I'll ask you to think about between now and when we open things up for questions is whether or not the historic relations between Syria and Lebanon have made a difference to the fact that you made very clear that the Lebanese government has been unwilling to formally step in here and manage the situation. Carmen Jaha, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Howard, and thank you, Jeff and Faten, for this. The title of my presentation is Living in Hell, and this is a title that is inspired by the Lebanese president, in fact, General Aoun, who went on TV in September 10, 2020, and said that the government is on its, the Lebanese people, the people of Lebanon, are on their way to hell unless a government is formed, and it's been 10 months and a government has not been formed. So I assume that we are already living in hell, and the Syrian refugees are also living in hell. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of hell. I'm going to talk a little bit about studying in hell, some insights from a project on schooling, and then talk a little bit about imagining futures. And then these 3 parts that I will talk about, politics, education, and imagining futures. These are ideas I got from research projects that I think this space with Metropolis is a good audience to talk about because of what Jan said is sort of the mission of this place, right? To get policymakers to talk to researchers, to look at activism across the world and see whether we're doing it right and what we can do better. It's very painful to talk about this and to say that it's been already more than 10 years. It's actually almost the 11th year. And I don't think that we as scholar activists or researchers have done enough to think a little bit outside the box about what we can do to preserve a minimum veneer of human dignity for Syrian refugees. I know that Lebanon is home also to other nationalities, particularly Palestinian refugees, but that's another ballgame. But for Syrian refugees, I think, you know, what Faten said in that we allowed them to live, but they're living in hell. So I'll talk a little bit about this idea. Lebanon has, you know, a sectarian power sharing system that was sealed with an amnesty for war crimes in 1989. So you have essentially a situation where warlords came down from their tanks and from their militias and decided to share power. Of course, Hezbollah retained and expanded its weapons, and like the others, decided to divide the spoils of the state. When the conflict in Syria began peaking 2013, Lebanon tried to disassociate itself from the conflict, but of course it didn't. Hezbollah is actively participating in the war in Syria. So Lebanon, your question, Howard, about the historical ties, it's not just the historical ties that complicate the situation, it's that Lebanese politicians don't agree on the nature of the conflict in Syria, and early on did not want to agree on the status of these people. So are they displaced persons? Are they refugees? Are they guests? Are they friends? Are they enemies? So it wasn't that the state was absent, it was that they did not converge on where their interest is. With time, they realized that their interest is in sectarianism. Yeah, everybody wants to send the refugees back because they want to put them on boats, send them to Syria, put them on buses, because they could agree that, you know, this human rights thing doesn't fit their agenda. But early on, they didn't realize yet what to do with them. So there was no status for these people. Largely open door policy until 2015 or so, like Faten said. In 2015, Lebanon asks UNHCR to stop registering Syrians. UNHCR complies. We don't have data on newborns. So conflicting discourses, conflicting policies. Almost 90% of people are in informal settlements and living in poverty. Syrian refugees in the north in particular are caught between rounds of fire. And by rounds of fire, I'm trying to make it sound nice. It's actually bombs and bullets. In Jabal Mahsen Bebet Tibbene in north of Tripoli. This went on from 2013 to 2016. Of course, Syrian refugees were in part mentioned in the narrative of the 2019 October revolution, with some asking that this revolution be intersectional and grant them their right, and others saying that, you know, we need to put them on a boat. And by others, I mean politicians, and send them back. So they're stuck in this, they're stuck in financial collapse, all the way up to the Beirut port explosion. So this is sort of the big picture. Now, juxtaposed to this, what really upsets me, and I've debunked this in a paper, is a narrative that we put forward on resilience, right? And many people have said this. I'm just going to say early on, so the concept coming out of the research on resilience that I work on is about how Lebanese state institutions are resilient, not people. People are not resilient. People are sick and hungry and they're dying and they're stuck in hell. What is resilient is a political system that knows how to bolster itself at every juncture, to the extent that Antonio Guterres calls Lebanon a key pillar in the international framework for the protection of Syrian refugees. Without it, that entire system would collapse. Can you imagine? People living in hell and then the Lebanese state almost earning a Nobel Prize. There's something wrong with the narrative, number one. Second, there's the problem about the role of the UN. So between 2011, 2014, like Faten said, there was absenteeism, like a deadlock of no policy, ministries turning a blind eye, NGOs can come in, the state is happy with the NGOs. Suddenly 2014, 2016, the state decides to sort of step up its game and begins wrapping its head around development programs and saying, you know, it's not only the Syrian refugees, it's also vulnerable Lebanese communities, which is true, but that is also exploitative. The London conference, Brussels conference, so suddenly there is an advent of the Lebanese state. But 2016 onwards, I think that it's not just that Lebanon is complying or showing up, but rather leading the narrative. There is a narrative by all of them, but particularly the Free Patriotic Movement, to try to send refugees back, to ask UNHCR to stop registering them, to close the borders abruptly. I am for border control, but there are families stuck halfway, right? The campaign to transfer funds back into Syria. Why is UN giving Lebanon money? Why doesn't it give it to Damascus? And it's a big mess. And there is a strong attempt, I think, to cloud the political policy narrative with this venomous sectarian card that keeps the system together but makes people stuck in hell. The third thing that emerges is this veneer of governance, right? As if as if Lebanon has a governance system, right? So, and I'm going to talk about this, really quickly, but just the styles in which Lebanon is governing is making concessions to Hezbollah, escaping to national dialogue without undergoing reform. I have a short piece on trading reform for resilience, right? So bolstering communities, bolstering NGOs, and of course benefiting from a great deal, probably until the Beirut blast, from a great deal of foreign patronage. And what the Lebanese political system does is basically there is collusion to disagree, but there is collusion to maintain the system, even after something as big as the explosion. There is no talk of radical change. There is no talk of reform. There is collusion. They don't shake hands, but there is collusion to keep the basic premise of sectarianism as such, to postpone elections. And what is relevant for this talk is to delegate and decentralize. So we see this with the Syria crisis response, and we see this with the Beirut explosion response, right? They want people to take over, let people clean the streets. You want to cook for refugees, you're most welcome. You want to do research about refugees, ahlan wa sahlan, right? It's this delegating and decentralizing responsibility to the extent that there's so much chaos that there really isn't a concerted effort to help people. And people who are among the most vulnerable are children. And this is a project that we are now sort of reviewing the material. It's called the Rebuild Project. I did this with Sarah Dryden-Peterson at the Harvard Graduate School of Government, and Bidur Shupra, as well as Rumana Talhouk, who's now at Oxford, on surviving schooling, right? And this project, looks at students who are in segregated school shifts and studies how teachers are or not able to deal with non-citizens in a context that is hellish and in a context of rising discrimination, and really criticizes or offers a critical perspective on how young people are stuck in an education system that allows them to envision a future, but a future that is not plausible given the context of hell that I just described. And so where we're at, I think many of us are interested in this and started to look at refugee return. So this is also not final. It's from my book project. It's early days, it's been a year. And it's asking people about what they think about their futures, and asking particularly women who've been in Lebanon a very long time how they think of their future. And again, this topic is stuck in the politics of hell because it's very polarized. If you talk about voluntary return, you are automatically seen as trying to keep the Syrians here, and that you are fueled because you don't like the Assad regime or you like the Assad regime. And if you say the opposite, oh, it's time for Syrians to return, then you are also complacent in sending people and putting them all on a bus. The problem with this is structural because we don't have the data. We don't know how many refugees are, and more importantly, we don't know who the refugees are. There isn't a face to these people's numbers and names. We don't know, right? There are guesses. And I believe this, and this is why I said in the beginning, we need to think better as researchers in a context of not a failed state, but a culprit state. We need to think about how we can complement the narrative with numbers and with stories so that we can dream of developing policy or programs. I have no hope that the Lebanese state will do anything, but maybe better programs to support different needs of people, because refugees are not a monolithic entity. And that's what this project is trying to do, is trying to look at the fear of persecution, incarceration, of course, but also to look at human beings' lives a decade away from home. And I'll share a couple of quotes when I ask about, what do you think about Syria? And she said, I dream about it, like about home, and I wish I could stop dreaming about it so much. It will never be, and it cannot be home again. Syria is a black box, and the ones who go in may never go out. And for people like me, it means suicide. So this is somebody who's been 7-8 years in Lebanon, in hell, who's saying, I don't want to go back. Just one more to give also a flavor. I can stop here. She says, life in Beirut made me more vocal, more open about my sexuality and my activism through art and writing and street protests. I can't imagine going back, even with all the guarantees in the world. The regime lies, kills, and gases its own people. Besides, even in a hypothetical scenario that there could be peace, my family would never accept me back in this way. So just to close, zooming in after the pictures that Faten showed, giving a description about really a situation that is hellish, a situation clouded by polarized politics, affecting the young, affecting women, but also, tearing people's lives apart. I'd like to pose the question back to you about what is it that we can do better so that we don't have to meet in 10 years and only lament. Maybe there is some hope somewhere that we can build better responses to the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. You paint, I'm sure, an accurate, but it is a bleak picture that you are giving us. And I want to thank you for that. We need this kind of reality check, as it were, because we do get an awful lot of talk from the international community. And, I don't intend any disrespect to those people who work very hard in the international community, but I can't help but notice the gulf between the realities on the ground that you have described along with Faten and Jeff, and the kind of conversations that we're hearing in places like New York and Geneva. My little question for you, Carmen, you are a researcher, but you are also an activist. In order for the kind of research and data that you referred to make a difference, who is your audience? Who does your audience need to be? So I'll let you spend a little bit of time on that. Now, before I go into the chat box, and there are some questions there that I do want to get to, I wonder if I can ask all three of you, starting with Jeff, then Faten, then Carmen, to very, very quickly respond to the little questions that I gave each of you. So Jeff, can I ask you to give us just a few words?
Yeah, and before I do so, let me say I very much agree with what Faten said. I think I worked a lot on UNHCR's policy on urban refugees and alternatives to camps in the 2000s, and I think we were somewhat naive in thinking it was a question of camps or no camps rather than empowerment or no empowerment. So I think you made a very strong point, and that. With respect to your question, Howard, for anybody who's not familiar with the concept, local integration refers to a situation where a refugee hosting government basically says that the refugees are allowed to remain in that country, to go through a naturalization process and to become citizens and permanent residents of that state with all of the rights that other citizens have. To be fair, to be honest, it's a concept that UNHCR has generally avoided for the last 20 or 25 years, primarily because it's not a welcome concept amongst most of the states which host large numbers of refugees in the world today. Most refugee hosting states would much rather refugees go back to their own country as quickly as possible rather than remain there indefinitely. And it's for that reason that in recent years there have been very, very few formal local integration programs in the global south. The only real kind of major one being in Tanzania, which a few years ago naturalized and gave citizenship to about 140,000 refugees from Burundi, but that's a very exceptional case. And most countries in the global south with large refugee populations are not really prepared to go in that direction. The question you ask is a really good one. And I have to say, it's not one that I'd particularly thought of before, which is if a potential country of asylum realizes that if it lets refugees across its borders and to come into its country, would they be more inclined to try and resist that movement because of the fact that they're likely to remain there for a very, very long time rather than going back to their own country? Now, I can't think of any specific situations where that has been the case. I think it might be useful to dwell just for a minute on the situation of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, 700,000 of whom fled to neighboring Bangladesh 3 years ago. Now, it was quite clear in that situation that Bangladesh, a very densely populated country, high levels of poverty, Bangladesh would have much rather not had 700,000 new refugees from Myanmar crossing its borders. But nevertheless, it did allow them to come in. And you have to ask yourself, why did it allow them to come in? And I think there are three main reasons, and they may be similar to some of the reasons in the Middle East as well. Firstly, most countries in the global south simply don't have the capacity to prevent large numbers of refugees from crossing their borders, which are often very porous borders. So Bangladesh certainly didn't have the capacity to prevent 700,000 people crossing its borders. And also it would not have looked particularly good in the international community for a country like Bangladesh to have been seen to be trying to prevent people escaping very evident persecution by closing its borders. So a practical issue, the capacity to prevent people crossing the border. Secondly, I think there was some genuine sympathy and empathy for the refugees within Bangladesh, and I'm sure one could say the same about Jordan and Lebanon in relation to Syrian refugees. And then the third reason why Bangladesh opened its borders, despite not really wanting the refugees, that it got quite a lot of assurances from the international community that the international community would essentially pick up the bill and meet the needs of the refugees for as long as they are in the country. That has led to an interesting dilemma, and I don't know whether it's also relevant to Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East, which is that, as I mentioned, the World Bank has become much more involved in refugee issues in recent years and actually went to the Bangladesh government and offered development assistance to help it cope with the refugee influx from Myanmar. The dilemma for the Bangladesh government was, if it accepted the development assistance, was it also acknowledging de facto that those refugees were going to be there for a very long time indeed and were not going to go back to their own country? So I think it'd be interesting to know whether anything similar has happened in Lebanon. Has there been any sense that if we accept especially a developmental approach to the Syrian refugee population, does that imply that they're going to be there for a long time, where clearly many politicians and prominent people in Lebanon would much rather see the refugees go back as quickly as possible?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for your reflections on that. And I would like to be able to just continue this as a natural conversation, but unfortunately we have a clock that is ticking. So I'm going to have to ask you, Faten, if you have any thoughts on the question that I gave to you.
Thank you, Jeff, for your question. So you asked about the historic influence of the historic relation between Lebanon and Syria and its influence on the situation today. It definitely has an influence because the collective memory of many Lebanese make them perceive the number of Syrians hosted as a new form of Syrian occupation, because they suffered from the occupation of the Syrian army. And the other thing is the Palestinian presence in the country that many blame for triggering the civil war in Lebanon, and that is also associated to Syrians and the presence of Syrians. The third point is the sectarian division in the country that Carmen referred to, and that make many people perceive the presence of such large Sunni population as an existential threat. However, these three existential dilemmas or points become less important. And this is something that Carmen pointed out too, with the actual struggle that the country is witnessing right now, with the international struggle that is happening on this small territory, with the level of corruption that, despite the hope that the 17th October revolution brought to many Lebanese, we now know that it is, it needs a miracle for things to change in Lebanon. So I think that this historical issue is less important than what is happening today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's actually an optimistic reply. Carmen, my little question to you.
Yes, on that note, you saluted, colleagues in the international community. I also salute myself and colleagues in Lebanon who are working relentlessly. It's not that there isn't work to try to show a different picture or to try to break a cycle. It's just that when we meet, I think it's important to identify, gaps that we can work towards. And my audience is us, it's peers, really. I mean, I'm not going and saying people in Beirut or in Syria or in London need to solve this. But as practitioners and scholars and citizens who are concerned, I think there is a way to advocate better. This is not just a money issue. This is a story issue, right? Whatever avenue you choose, Jeff, yes, this is a developmental problem. Even if people push back, right? This is a developmental problem. This is a regional stability problem, right? We don't want to have pockets of violence. So if you are scared of pockets of violence, so it's like when we make the argument, there is a moral argument here, there is a regional stability argument, there is a development argument, there is a human rights argument. Either one we choose, we got to do a better job. And I think that, if anything, the last 2 years have been so horrible across the world that it's time to say, let's do it differently. And I think we can do that by bringing multi-stakeholder partnerships. It doesn't have to leave out the private sector. It doesn't have to be the activism alone. It doesn't have to be the institutions, the universities alone. It doesn't have to be the international community alone to advocate for a different model, I think, and to bring refugee voices into these places and to talk about repatriation to other places and to see, like, the project about futures is to what do they want and who are they and where are they and how many are they, so we can develop responsive programming, whether it's housing or education or repatriation or settlement or resettlement. So that's my answer to you. I'm talking to myself and to people like us.
That's fine, thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience, and the clock continues to tick away, so I'll be very brief, and I'll ask you, when you answer these questions, to also be very brief. One question, quite provocative: is the situation in Lebanon, which seems disastrous and disorganized, very different from refugee camps elsewhere? Another question: I would be curious to hear about some civil society actions, local or global, that have happened or are happening towards supporting these precarious conditions. And the next question, and then we'll take a break. I'd like to ask Professors Kakano and Jeha if you have any information or data regarding new trends among Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Lebanese people now facing more difficulties and considering new massive displacement towards Europe and other countries, as especially after the Beirut blast, more Lebanese are thinking and trying to leave the country. And we've also had a number of people comment about how grateful they are for the fantastic presentations that you gave. So with those questions in mind, some final words from you, and I'll go in reverse order if I may. Jeha?
So briefly, because I couldn't see the first two questions on whether the situation in Lebanon is very different than in other refugee camps. Yes, of course, and I'll defer to Faten. On this issue of civil society, local and global initiatives, there's a lot, really. I mean, there are people doing mental health, there are people working on gender, people working on employment, the Beirut Urban Lab, our colleagues, Drs. Mona Harab and Fawaz are working on housing. There's a lot. So maybe, the person who asked it can reach out and we'll start an email chain. There's plenty. And on the issue of Syrians wanting to leave Lebanon, everybody who can is trying to leave Lebanon. But I have anecdotes. I don't have data. And that's part, I think, of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Faten?
Yes, Jeff, I would like to reply to the first question about the difference between refugees inside camps and refugees in Lebanon. I've been to the Zatari camp and in a humanitarian workshop targeting young Syrians. And it breaks my heart when I hear Carmen talks about the fact that children in Lebanon do not have access to education, because this is exactly the case of young people in the Zatari camp who did not ask to go on vacation, who did not ask to, to travel, to have fun. All they were asking for was, we need to continue our education. So is there a difference? That's the first part of my answer. The second part, what I would have wanted to show in my presentation was a zoom on what is happening inside the organized camps that I showed. The situation in Lebanon outside camps, if we compare the situation in Lebanon, outside camps and inside camps. Outside camps, it is so precarious that refugees who are hosted in one of these organized camps are in a much better situation. They have free housing, they have services, electricity, water, sanitation, they have a mosque, a hospital, a school, a dental clinic, a pharmacy. They are more or less protected from being arrested by the army. So once more, the question is not about the settlement type or the settlement policy. It's about inclusion, about protection, about dignity, empowerment, and giving refugees their rights and a voice.
Yes, you've reminded us of the exceptional nature of the situation in Lebanon. Thank you, Faten. Jeff, your final words.
Yeah, I think the thing that's always struck me about Lebanon is the whole question of the geographical dispersal of the refugee population, whereas in many other countries, refugees are likely to be found, in one or two specific locations, whether they're in camps or not. But Lebanon, it's always struck me that people are incredibly widespread throughout the country. And just to end with a question, which we probably won't have time to discuss, but I remember in the early days of the Syrian refugee influx into Lebanon, and the fact that these people were living amongst the population and were to be found everywhere, that they were very visible. A number of people were saying at that time, look, this is not a sustainable situation. There's going to be growing tensions between Syrians and these people. And eventually we can't rule out the idea of some kind of, physical violence between the two groups of people. And I know that there have been kind of odd incidents that I've heard about over the years, but that kind of large-scale violence pitting the refugees against the local population doesn't seem to have taken place. And I'd be interested either now or some other time to discuss why that hasn't taken place, why those restrictions prove to be so wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're now at the end of our session. I just want to thank our speakers for what I regard as really exceptional presentations and exceptional insights into an extraordinarily difficult situation in Lebanon. Now, of course, Lebanon is not the only country to face extraordinarily difficult situations, but what I can't help but note is the difference in the situation on the ground there and the kind of sanitized presentation of refugee situations that one gets reading documents like the Global Compact on Refugees, where it seems neat and tidy, but the reality on the ground is far from it. So thank you to our speakers, Jeff Crisp, Faten Kakano, and Carmen Jeha, for a very, very stimulating session today. Thank you to Metropolis and to Jan Roth for making this happen. And Jan, if I can invite you to give us very last comments, and I will thank you for that. You're muted.
I noticed. Thank you very much. And also thank you for sharing this event. There's a few things that I would like to mention. There were questions about papers. We'll ensure that papers will be circulated to you in the course of this week, so that more information is available if you really want to go deeper. Secondly, if you want to stay posted of Metropolis events, I recommend you either check our Facebook page or our Twitter account or our LinkedIn, whatever it is, etc. To be sure, when you registered, you left your email addresses, and many of you, most of you actually, indicated that they wanted to be informed about Metropolis activities, and that's what we intend to do. There is a number of webinars in the making, and we will sort of roll them out in the course of, say, the next year, leading to the Metropolis International Conference in Berlin in September 22. But we will inform you about that. Finally, this webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be made available online on our YouTube account. And I will send each of you a personal email informing you when that has been done, and also where you can download or view the video. With that being said, thank you so much, speakers and the chair of this event. Thank you for all those who attended this meeting. Thank you very much. See you next time.